So as I mentioned, Indivisible Berkeley's economic justice team was really fortunate. In fact, we were sort of struggling because we were a relatively small team and figuring out how do we have sort of the capacity to do all the actions that we want to do. And we were really fortunate to engage with our two next speakers, and they've really helped revitalize us. One is Sandy Emerson, who really put this on, and David Ellison as well. So, Sandy Emerson is a retired software executive and heads the Move Your Money campaign for fossil-free California. Inspired by divestment pledges made for the 2014 People's Climate March, Sandy has been giving presentations on why and how to divest a personal portfolio from fossil fuels, and how to move your money out of polluting banks and credit cards, and how to begin exploring investments in clean energy technologies. As a personal divestment evangelist, Sandy believes in the power of individuals to move markets away from fossil fuels and other unhealthy investments in order to make way for a world of clean energy in a peace economy.
When I became involved with divestment, I had a portfolio which was sort of an accident of capitalism. I joined a startup that started up and continued, and I ended up with a portfolio of various things. And I took a look at some of those. I was horrified to find that I was invested in Keystone XL. I was invested in this, that, and the other thing. But during the process of working through those investments, I never changed my banks. I never thought about my banking. With the indigenous-led activism around Dakota Access Pipeline, it became clear that anyone with a banking relationship can make a difference by moving their money out of polluting banks. We all know that investments in fossil fuel companies will become worthless, but why wait for that to happen? You can move your money now and help render the transition that much faster. The fossil fuel companies depend on the valuation of their reserves to make themselves look like a going concern. And they depend on capital expenditures for exploring for new sources of oil, extreme fuels, and dirty fuels everywhere to make themselves look like a going concern. Exxon, for a brief period in 2016 or something, moved out of funding new capital projects, and the share prices dropped because the belief system of the market is that you have to continue to grow and grow and grow and drill and expand and relentlessly pursue new sources of reserves. As you know, 80% of these reserves have to stay in the ground if we are to avoid catastrophic climate warming. The actions started by the Defund DAPL movement amplified bank activism. It really began with the crash of 2008, when it became clear what bad actors banks are and how little they care about the welfare of their customers. During the Occupy movement in 2011, there were also bank exits. But the Dakota Access Pipeline movement and the data that accompanied it, the wonderful volunteer-led research that exposed how the banks and how the project managers of those banks are connected to the pipeline projects. That's what really started this landslide of bank exits. The total, as Alex pointed out, is some $15 billion so far and counting. There are so many reasons to break up with megabanks. They invest in pipelines and prisons and nukes, and not to mention fossil fuels, all the name brands. 25 megabanks invested $785 billion in damaging fossil fuels from 2013 to 2015. The Rainforest Action Network is one of these great data centers that pulls all this stuff together. They do a report every year on bank investments and how carbon project financing is going. There was a sort of dip in bank financing for fossil fuel projects in the run-up to the Paris Climate Accord. But once we got past that, and of course once Trump pulled out, the financing resumed, even for coal. Who would invest in coal? But the banks are forming this part of a belief system that is purely fictitious. It doesn't have any strength except the perceptions of people who continue to invest. So Food and Water Watch and Rainforest Action Network did connect the dots. I understand, David Elliston, that you asked Bank of America during that time when you became activated by Dakota Access Pipeline. You said, so are you funding the Dakota Access Pipeline? And I understand that they said, no, we're not funding the pipeline. Well, they're funding the project company that funds the pipeline. There's a wonderful data guy, I think he's in Seattle, who makes all of these connections clear little by little. It's a very tangled web, how all these companies are structured and their ownership, and it all sort of feeds into the project itself. Energy Transfer Partners, you may have heard that name. It's the project manager company, and it is currently suing Greenpeace, among others, for interfering with its business. We'll see how that goes. So, do bank actions count? Yes, they do. The CEOs of banks and the CEOs of project management firms pay attention, and they even get annoyed enough to file baseless lawsuits. In all, 35 banks funded directly or indirectly the Dakota Access Pipeline. All the name brands, you can see their logos here. When you're thinking about where you put your money, you are thinking about, is your money aligned with your values? You know that money talks, so what is your money saying about you? And it is your money. About 45% of the $17.3 trillion in deposits are controlled by the 4 largest banks. So start at the top, divest from them. In all, individual households own about 80% of the $30 trillion equity market, 38% directly. And it's your money. And it's our money. 11 trillion of these assets are controlled by women. The first thing you want to know when you're changing your banking relationship is, so where do I move my money? Credit unions, as has been pointed out, are a good bet. There are socially responsible banks. There are community financial development institutions, which are a specialized type of bank that invest in low-income communities and community projects. Look for a bank like Beneficial State Bank that's a B Corp, which is, required and has signed up and is certified to reinvest in the community. Your local banks may have local investments, mainly centering around vehicles and real estate rather than pipelines and prisons. The mega banks, some of them invest a lot in community projects. It's part of, polishing their image. And look what Wells Fargo is trying to do with its reinvention campaign. Their share price got really hammered by all the scandals. It's sort of plateauing. But the mega banks are operating globally, and they may assert that they are removing funding from pipeline projects or extreme fuel projects, but it bears watching. There's a wonderful website called bankstalking.org that reads the security filings and gets way down into the details. And usually if a bank says, like U.S. Bank, no, we're not going to do any more such and such projects, it turns out that another arm of U.S. Bank will have extended a line of credit for these same projects. So get away from the mega banks. There are lots of other options. Credit unions are pervasive. They are extremely accepting. They have more free ATMs than big banks. And there are good research tools like banklocal.info where you can type in your town name or your zip code. You will get a list of banks within a geographical radius, and then you can get a report card on an individual bank. The site NerdWallet has a good list of banks. And Green America has a deep list of resources, including lists of socially responsible banks. The recipe for moving your checkings and savings account was put out by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau years ago. It's repeated and repeated, this list of steps. But obviously, you open a new account before you close your other account. You make sure that all your direct deposit and automatic payments have been moved over. But the most important step when you close your big bank account is to write a letter to the CEO of that bank and say why you're closing your account, and put a copy on file with your local bank as well. The CEO may very well send you a direct communication. It happens. I've heard it. But the most important part is how you feel once you have summoned your resolve and you have moved your money and stated so in writing. During bank actions, it's often possible to take this action with others, to do your closing of your account as part of a bank action. That's particularly effective. And don't forget about your credit cards. You need to open clean credit cards because the processors, Visa, Discover, MasterCard, whatever, are affiliated quite often with the mega banks. Speaking personally, I had a serious addiction to my Chase Mileage Plus Explorer, but I changed. There are responsible credit cards. If you bank with a different bank, they may offer a credit card, and so there you are. There are a lot of affinity cards available from TCM Bank, which is a mild-mannered, a clean investing bank that sponsors cards for Amazon Watch, for Green America, and others. And interestingly, one of my main affinities, REI, offers a credit card from U.S. Bank, so that's no good. When you're moving your money, you think, okay, so I've moved my so many dollars. Does this have an effect? But some researchers charted a decline in new deposits after no DAPL activism, and the top darker areas changed to lighter areas when new deposits declined. As Alex said, they lost billions of dollars. There have been many cities that take bank divestment resolutions, Seattle and San Francisco among them. It's effective, of course, when cities take resolutions because that's big bucks, but each individual resolution is important too. The other side of the equation, which I will introduce before David shows you how to see what's in your portfolio, is fossil fuel divestment. I became energized by the 2014 People's Climate March when the Rockefeller Brothers Fund divested from fossil fuels. I thought if the heirs to an oil fortune would divest from fossil fuels, then what was I waiting for? And I wanted to teach other people how to divest their portfolios, and the most important thing is being able to find out what's in there. For years, I was a passive investor. I had no idea. The first step in this process is to set your intention. There's a group called divestinvest.org that takes individual pledges. You pledge not to invest in the Carbon Underground 200. You pledge to sell your current investments and reinvest in the new energy economy. It's really important to set your intention. The divestinvest.org, like Mazaska Talks, is accumulating these pledges, and as of this date, Divest Invest has identified worldwide from individuals and institutions a total of $6.3 trillion assets under management that have been pledged to divest. It all adds up. It's adding up in a spectacular way. The divestment movement is one of the fastest growing social movements of this century. You should also think about your 401k, and you should educate your advisor. That's often a very important step. Cities have done fossil fuel divestments. We had a lovely pledge from New York City in December saying that they would divest their 5 common retirement funds to the tune of $5.2 billion. The World Bank has signed on. The Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund has signed on. This is when their sovereign wealth comes from oil. The Statoil company, in fact, in Norway, is rebranding itself to get oil out of its name. The entire country of Ireland has pledged to divest from fossil fuels, and Senator Jeff Berkeley of Oregon has just introduced a bill that would divest one part of the civil service funds, so divest the feds. Lots of cities have divested. Yesterday, divestinvest.org announced a Divest Cities campaign, so these municipal resolutions are going to keep coming in and keep adding up. There is statistical evidence as well that divestment announcements depress share prices. The red dips below are where share prices fell below what would have been expected following divestment announcements. Not only that, but the world of socially responsible investing is growing fast. You no longer have to assume that if you're going to be socially responsible that you may lose money. Socially responsible investing has grown 33% in the last few years, represents $8.72 trillion of assets under management out of $40 trillion total, and the performance regularly exceeds, the performance of traditional funds. As You Sow just published a report. It's interesting because As You Sow has focused on engagement with fossil fuel companies, but this could be changing. They reported some data from Corporate Knights that New York would have been $15 billion richer if it had divested from fossil fuels in the last 10 years. And the state of Massachusetts would have been $3 billion richer if it had divested from fossil fuels. So it pays to divest. I encourage you to move your money, and divestment works. Thank you.
David Elston is a software developer and a divestment leader for 350 Silicon Valley. Like many, he was called to climate action by the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. He started campaigning against fossil fuel banking and giving Move Your Money workshops, often with Sandy, around the Bay. In fact, there's one going on tonight, correct, at Santa Clara University, in case any of you are heading back to the peninsula. But throughout all this, David has a dark secret. He was part owner of every public oil company in the world. Every drop of oil padded his 401k. As he struggled to divest, David vowed to make it easier for others. David will introduce sustainable investing and show you how you can take control of the impact of your investments. He'll demo the tool he's been developing, which uses impact data from nonprofits and others to help you build a clean portfolio.
Hi, my name is David Elliston. You can find me at cleanmoney.us, which is my project and where I put resources out for like where you can find banks and such. I'll be talking about finance, so I should mention, and we need some kind of disclaimer, that I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not a financial professional, and that I can't give like paid advice to people, basically. My idea with cleanmoney.us is to give peer-to-peer advice, to help each other and support each other through the transition out of this. But with regard to investing, past performance is not indicative of future results. All investing involves risk, and this data is believed to be accurate. So how did we get here? I haven't been to many protests myself until the last couple years. I'm an engineer. I used to sitting behind a desk, but we got to this moment, right? You know, after the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and I realized that my Bank of America checking account was sitting there helping Bank of America fund all these things. I felt a new emotion, something we started to learn about in 2017. I felt complicit. It was kind of an emotional shock for me, and I think that Thanksgiving in 2016 was a low point, the lowest point, a total emotional wreck for me as an American citizen, to watch and learn about the protests and the violent actions that were taking place in the Dakota Access, on the Dakota Access Pipeline event under Barack Obama as president, right? So things did not look good, and I think we were all looking for some lever. What power do I have, since that system's not working for me? And after cleaning up my Bank of America account, I realized what power money has. And it felt very satisfying to move over to a credit union, to go into the office and give Bank of America a piece of my mind. It was kind of short-lived, though, because when I went out and started presenting with Sandy and others, I learned what you guys know now, that there is carbon in our retirement accounts. There is toxic assets in our nest egg. And in fact, I personally realized that, yes, I owned hundreds of oil companies. Pretty much every public toxic company that you can imagine, I owned. And perhaps many of you do. Does anybody here have like a mutual fund, or in their 401k, or maybe an IRA, something like that? So, and some of you may have pensions, which we didn't talk about much, where you don't have much control over this, of what they invest in. But many of us have these retirement accounts, and so I faced mine. And it was bad news. I went to the Fossil Free Fund site from As You Sow, which we'll be hearing about, seeing about, and I looked up my typical mutual fund. This is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. So, by the way, this is in like so many 401ks out there you can't imagine. In fact, the default that people are directed to is to have, their money in this fund and a couple others. It's considered an appropriate thing to put it in, right? And what it has, Fossil Free Funds has this fantastic tool for breaking down what is in the mutual fund. And so obviously this mutual fund total stock market index contains kind of every US public company you could reasonably invest in. So there's thousands of them. And this includes producers of carbon, like the Carbon Underground, the largest holders of carbon who actually are priced on their carbon. Includes very little coal industry, they're kind of dead, but oil industry is big there, and then all the consumers. So you can kind of add it up, and there are different ways of measuring this, and different numbers you can jump onto. But here, I think a useful number is at 10%. This is 10% of the companies in the stock market have, oil and gas as their main businesses, or significant polluters because of their consumption of it. And with the S&P 500, which I hope everyone has heard of, it's a little worse, 11%. But I mean, it's kind of consistent. In fact, most mutual funds are going to have a lot of fossil fuels in them. And so I wanted to get rid of that. I wanted to get rid of fossil fuels from my portfolio. And what I took for a target was to reduce my carbon footprint. And when I show you live this site of fossil-free funds later and we click through it, you'll see that you can look at the average carbon weight of all the companies in your portfolio. And you can start to look for sets of companies that have been optimized for not having so much carbon. So, in fact, there are simple things you can do right now. You can buy the S&P 500 without the main fossil fuel producers. This is a ticker. It's a fairly easy thing to sell your S&P 500 fund and buy an S&P 500 without mutual fund, without fossil fuels fund, SPYX, if you're looking. So this is like a simple step you can take. Now, it still has 6% fossil fuel. It's not like super clean because of the consumer side, but the products are out there. There are simple things that we can do to move our money. And there are funds out there that are actually really clean, right? If you go to fossil-free funds, you can research and find the funds that have no carbon in them. No, sorry, not no carbon, but no oil companies, no fossil-free, no fossil producers, no fossil consumers. And so I spent a lot of time on fossil-free funds last year looking at the profile of different funds. But I was also a pretty serious do-it-yourself investor. I had a lot of asset classes and a very complicated portfolio. And it's not actually that easy. If you look inside a fund like Parnassus Endeavor, it's great that it has 88% less carbon footprint than your typical fund. But it also is not exactly like your typical fund. It is well known, it's very famous, it's been doing great. It also has like 20% of its holdings in Qualcomm and Gilead. Very not big companies, right? So this is not a total stock market index anymore. You're making very serious bets on something. It's not, the kind of diversified fund. So to sort of, if you start looking for diversified funds, and you can do this, you can go to fossil-free funds. You can find my presentation later and find out all the things to punch in. But you look for a large stock fund that's fully diversified, and you'll find like 9, right, out of 10,000 funds. There are 9 large cap funds that are diversified, and some of them we talked about, like Parnassus. This is labeled as diversified, and a handful of funds. So it's not quite ready for us just to jump over onto these things. It is a little more complicated than it looks. So I did spend last year learning a bit about sustainable investing, explain what I learned and how I learned to bring portfolios together, and then the tools that maybe you can start to take a look at to see what's inside of yours and start to get comfortable with the new options out there. So how much time do I have? Minutes. Wow, I must be talking quickly. Terminology. So socially responsible investing is what this was called in the 80s. This is when grandma went in there. She didn't want tobacco or whatever. It has evolved over time, but fortunately the acronym has stayed the same. It is still SRI. It is now called sustainable, responsible, and impact investing. And here is the industry definition. This type of investing is a discipline that considers environmental, social, and governance criteria in addition to financial criteria when deciding what to invest in. And so, as Sandy pointed out, looking at the US, $8 trillion, looking globally, this was 2 years ago, $23 trillion. This stuff has been happening, but it hasn't been happening for us. I mean, us, unless you are a wealthy person, it hasn't been really accessible to you until more recent years. But the wealthy people have been doing this and doing fine. Now it's coming to us, and we need to figure out a way to make that come very quickly. So just to give you the quick sense of what is impact investing, there are different types, and this is not my slide, this is from Morgan Stanley, so they're very respectable. The first type was called restriction screening. Like, I don't want fossil fuels in my portfolio. I want the S&P 500 without fossil fuels. So that was that kind of ticker where you have that kind of fund is a restrictive fund, and you can get rid of tobacco, and you can start to filter out many things. And this is like this was version 1 of socially responsible that happened, back in the earlier days. I don't want to own that. That much I know. I don't know what I want to own, but I don't want that. And what that evolved into in the last, say, 15 years is this ESG, environmental social governance. people start to use words like sustainability. But what it means is that companies, when you're deciding as a mutual fund manager, I say I'm going to manage a fund and it's going to look like an index fund, but it's going to be better somehow. It's going to be more tolerable. You're going to like the components in there. And the way they do that is they measure every single company in there on criteria of how good or bad they are, and they try to find the mutual funds that, or they try to compose their mutual fund from the best actors out there. The other two dimensions we'll see less of. Thematic exposure means I want to own solar. I want to own this particular thing. And yeah, we can all do that. It's very common to own 5 or 10% energy, but if you put 50% of your money into solar, you're in for a really rocky ride. So thematic exposure is something we bring in for diversification and also because we have conviction. I want to invest in clean energy. I'm not going to lose my shirt, but I don't quite know what it's going to do. I'll put in my small amount of that. And then impact investing is not going to be available to you in the public markets. If you look at that end of the scale, they start to talk about things that don't provide competitive returns. And it is basically very difficult, if not impossible, to find something for sale in mutual funds that aren't intended to provide competitive returns. But as we evolve together, I would like to help others find ways to invest in those things that maybe have a charitable component, and that may be more in the private area. I want that technology to succeed enough that I'm going to be, charitably involved in that. Or I want community-based bonds, and I'm willing to put 5% of my bonds into community development bonds at lower interest rates to my community members. But here we're pretty much talking about taking your portfolio, managing the risk, and trying to get the same return you've been hoping for in the past without having to own toxic things. And just in terms of what ESG means, this is kind of a bunch of criteria, but from an environmental side, you might measure the cleanliness of things, technology, pollution, water use. From a social perspective, labor relations, and from a governance side, board diversity. We'll actually look at another way of looking at this. This is 17 of them. Okay, and then how does it perform? Well, there are nice long-term track records here. So looking at the all-country world index, every stock that people can kind of buy, they have a ex-fossil fuel version of that, like the S&P 500 one that I showed you, and it's been doing just fine. Yeah, of course, it's doing a little better because fossil fuel is kind of on its grim, decline, but it generally performs like the overall market. Now, if you look at the social index KLD, which has been around for like 25 years, this isn't about fossil fuel anymore. This is about some kind of social metrics, and they're looking at these companies and judging them, and it also has basically kind of performed like the market, maybe a little better. But generally, these funds are trying to behave like you would expect, but give you exposure to the people who you want to be with. So I'm going to jump into a demo now, because what I found, you have this fossil-free fund site, and you can go there, you go into your account, you see like your biggest holding, and then type in that ticker into fossil-free funds, and you get the bad news. Okay, but how do we clean it up? I spent hundreds of hours last year doing this for myself because I'm a little fussy about asset allocations, but this is what normally people own. This is what you will typically find yourself ushered into in any 401k is a target date fund or a fund that has multiple pieces to it, and it may even evolve over time with you. If you say, I want to retire in 2040, it'll slowly move the bond number up. The point is that your return is essentially 90% dictated by the asset classes you choose. We're supposed to have these 4 types of asset classes. So if you're going to compose your alternative, cleaner portfolio, you just need to be finding these pieces of it. And that's why I built this tool. So I'm going to jump into a demo now, because what I found, you have this fossil-free fund site, and you can go there, you go into your account, you see like your biggest holding, and then type in that ticker into fossil-free funds, and you get the bad news. Okay, but how do we clean it up? I spent hundreds of hours last year doing this for myself because I'm a little fussy about asset allocations, but this is what normally people own. This is what you will typically find yourself ushered into in any 401k is a target date fund or a fund that has multiple pieces to it, and it may even evolve over time with you. If you say, I want to retire in 2040, it'll slowly move the bond number up. the point is that your return is essentially 90% dictated by the asset classes you choose. We're supposed to have these 4 types of asset classes. So if you're going to compose your alternative, cleaner portfolio, you just need to be finding these pieces of it. And that's why I built this tool. So this tool has been my dream to build since I was manually working with fossil-free funds for many, many hours. The idea is to bring that impact data into the portfolio planning process. And one dimension to this is simply to rate 401ks that are out there. So for instance, we come in here and we've put in some of the funds for various 401ks like Google. We might want to know, well, what's in the Google 401k? The Google company has presented these funds to its employees, said, these are the funds available to you. Let's see how we're doing. And what we'll get into a eye chart level table, but first in the process of building a portfolio in your 401k, you would choose your investment time horizon in order to give yourself an asset allocation. And so this is something you might want to figure out on your own. There are tools out there, but 20% bonds would be an appropriate allocation for somebody my age and for quite a range of people. Next, we want to try to help you customize what your impact priorities are. So we have data, measurements of companies in various dimensions, and then the question is what is valuable or most important to you? When we measure something like Earth, we're looking at the efficiency of a company in terms of its water usage or power usage, its adoption of renewable energy and such. And so the ratings that we present here are based on that kind of thing. If we present wealth, it has more to do with equal access to pay, employees not being brutally overpaid, just looking at the economic side of things. And on the equality side, looking more about board diversity. There are great data on the performance of non-diverse boards. They are not doing particularly well. The 17% of boards out there with no women on them are underperforming. And so you might simply, and in fact, this data is not mine. This data is coming from a company called Hip Investor that's been doing ratings for the last decade and is here in San Francisco. So they're supplying this data, and I'm explaining a bit about how they look at ratings. But their philosophy is not entirely about the impact, but also the benefit of, the financial benefit of sustainable companies, that a company that is operationally efficient tends to have better returns. A company with a diverse board tends to have better returns. So that's where they're coming from. But this is simply a ratings mechanism, and then we allow you to kind of overweight things that you may want, and obviously Earth will choose today. And then now we look at the funds. And so we're working on ways to make this a little more easy to understand, but these below are the funds, in Google's 401k. This is typical. Let me close this one because it's probably the least helpful. But for instance, Dodge & Cox stock is a popular fund in 401ks and it's a nice value fund. What we can expose here from the As You Sow is the fossil content of this fund. So we take the number from As You Sow, which you can get from their site, we embed it in here so that you can start to compare funds against each other and find them in that context. And then we also want to bring in other data from their site. For instance, I don't know, I guess I'm not supposed to make fun of Google. I guess Google thinks maybe 5% is approximately the amount of fossil fuel you should have. When we bring in guns, we'll find out what an appropriate amount of guns, gun companies that I should own according to the fiduciaries over at Google. But anyway, my point here is actually Google tries to be a leader here. And this is their 401k. And this is the reality. This is why we need to take action together and move our money into these sustainable products to make them viable to put into 401ks so that we can get into full change of the holdings of people. So if you don't have a 401k or you want to build your own, then let me just try to get back to the beginning. So you can also build your own ultimate portfolio. In a 401k, you're obviously very restricted to their fund choices. But if you're just rolling over your IRA at Fidelity or wherever, you have thousands of choices, which is not necessarily helpful. And so that's something that we're also going to help. Good news is there's like 200 sustainable funds out there. You don't have to choose from 2,000. And most of them are reasonable choices. But what you can do is you can come through and look and build this up a piece by piece. You can look at funds and the fossil content of various funds. You can look at ratings that reflect you. And we're looking for ways to bring together the process of choosing funds and then looking at the ratings. And another thing that you can do is bring in predefined portfolios. So I know it's hard to find selections of funds, and guess what? People write about this stuff on newsletters and whatever. Here's a portfolio. So we'll just bring in these portfolios. Here's Morningstar's example. Okay, bring it in. And so that you can see, well, how much guns do I get with that portfolio, right? And my hope is that advisors will come, put on free portfolios here for us to use, offer their services in addition for premium people who need advice, but there will be nice canned portfolios that have been defined at your asset class. You know, here's a health impact portfolio. There are specific funds that this advisor has curated that have kind of strong health ratings. And, you know, frankly, when you build a modern portfolio, these robo-advisors are putting 25, 30 funds into it. So eventually we'll help you build something that's really sophisticated. But the idea here is to help you build something simple. And we would appreciate, anyone wants to give this tool a try. We're trying to make it helpful for folks. And just to, I have to show that these are connected to As You Sow. So when you click through on the fossil percent here, you can get into the As You Sow screens and all their details as well. And so that's the integration we're trying to provide. Thanks.
Claire Brown is an economics professor at UC Berkeley, where she teaches Buddhist economics. I can't tell you how happy I know that that even exists. To undergrads and development engineering to graduate students, her work focuses on creating sustainable economy that supports a meaningful life for all people. Her research teams focus on evaluating economic performance for California and for global economies, and on analyzing the financial risk of holding fossil fuel assets. Claire works with Fossil Free California and 350 Bay Area, where she focused her lobbying on passing SB 100. Governor signed yesterday, right? And SB 964 this session. Please welcome Claire Brown.
Can we create an economy that cares for both the human spirit and our planet Earth, with well-being and happiness for all people? Our materialistic and wasteful carbon-based economy has created enormous inequality. The rich lead lavish lifestyles, while billions of others suffer in poverty. Our relentless consumption has plundered the environment and sickened the Earth. Yet we remain stubbornly obsessed with free market economics. At the heart of free market economics are three false beliefs about humans and the world we live in. 1. People are self-centered, caring only about themselves. 2. People are chasing after income to support fancy lifestyles. And 3. The environment exists for human domination. It's clear our economic focus on increasing income and consumption just isn't working. Is there a different model? Yes. Buddhist economics is based on 3 truths. 1. Human nature is kind and altruistic. 2. People are interdependent with each other. And 3. People are interdependent with nature. We can escape the cycle of disappointment and despair that comes from endlessly chasing after money, from always wanting more and more. We can use awareness to enjoy life to the fullest without relying on consumerism. In Buddhist economics, economic performance means delivering well-being to everyone, not just delivering more income to the rich. When the rich have even more income, they buy bigger mansions and yachts and travel to more exotic places. When low-income families have more money, they live healthier, more fulfilling lives. Society becomes better off when we reduce status consumption by the wealthy and increase basic consumption by those at the bottom. Buddhist economics shows us how to get off the materialistic treadmill and focus on the things that are important to us, living mindfully and caring for Mother Earth and each other.
One of the big messages that I have as an economist from a systems approach is that the whole message today, which we heard in great detail where we could really do it, is that in fact we have to all work together on 2 levels. We have to work individually to decide how we can use our resources to stop supporting fossil fuel and to create a clean energy and equitable economy. And one of the slides I wanted to show you is that the problems of inequality and the problems of fossil fuel emissions go together. And so that 10% of the richest people in the country, and not in the country, I'm sorry, in the world, and we're all in that 10%, we emit 50% of the carbon emissions. This is from an Oxfam report. The bottom 50% of people around the world are responsible for 10% of the carbon emissions. So inequality and carbon emissions go together. And those are our two biggest economic problems. So now is the time for us to really create and completely restructure the economy so that we create an economy that's sustainable and where we're caring for people and people's well-being. And we can do that. And today we're starting to talk about how we can do it as individuals and then how we can do it at the community level. And you can extend that out to policies. Economists know all the policies that help us reduce inequality and share prosperity. We've known them for decades. Not that we're politically doing them, but we know them. And we have bits and pieces around the world where it's happening, but we all need to come together and make it happen. We need the political will to reduce the inequality and share prosperity. And we also know how to reduce carbon emissions. We have all of those policies. Now let me tell you that yesterday, oh, and these also all go together, and that yesterday I was at one climate event where we were talking about transitioning and staying under the 2-degree scenario, and they had somebody from Chevron. And by the way, I live by a Chevron refinery over in Point Richmond, so I know way too much about Chevron, but I also know about what it's like to live there and to care for the children. So Chevron gets up and gives a song and dance that they all are giving, which is, hey, people want fossil fuels. We're just giving them the energy they need and demand. It's an essential part of their life. That's all we're doing. And so it's all laid on the demand side. There's no discussion of the supply side, except that, of course, on the supply side, all the big fossil fuel industries are quickly as they can, trying to get their reserves out of the ground and therefore into their assets and sold. And so you say, well, just a second, what about the carbon budget? You know, we have a carbon budget and you've got to keep a lot of this in the ground. But meanwhile, as we already know, they continue making investments that make no sense, that are financed by banks. And any economist who studies this will tell you, these are really stupid investments. They expect the return over a long period of time, and they're not going to get it. And so that question of why they keep doing it, it's like, when I talk to oil executives, they are just in another world. They truly don't think that they have to keep it in the ground or that they're going to get it out of the ground in time. And you keep talking about the carbon budget, and they say, well, they talk about silver bullets. Well, as an economist, one thing I can tell you is there are no silver bullets. And what I loved about the panel today is there are lots and lots and lots of policies we can be doing and should be doing. And we need to do it in two ways once again. We need to individually live mindfully and have a low carbon footprint and make sure our assets are not supporting fossil fuel. But we mainly need to get off the sofa and do what we're doing today, which is come together and work with a group. I work with 350 and Bay Area, and I work with Fossil Fuel California, which I love. And it is so fantastic when you work really hard on like SB 100. I can't tell you how many thousands of activists around California were dancing all over the place when Jerry Brown finally signed. And it is a big deal. It's historic. So my role actually is the final call to action. And so from a systems approach, we know that we don't want to support fossil fuels on the supply side, and that's where divestment comes in. When you're divesting, you're really reducing the supply of fossil fuels because you're making it too expensive. And you're really helping to keep it in the ground. And on the demand side, you have to really think about your own use as well as where you put your assets. That's part of it, but it's really important. One of your biggest assets we didn't talk about today, and that's your vehicle. And you really do need to go electric or to really stop using your car as much as possible to help create livable cities and get out there and really work with your communities to create efficient buildings, livable cities, take public transit. I take BART as much as I can, although I do have an EV with 100% clean energy. I'm so grateful for MCE. And here's another Chevron story. A wonderful use of Chevron land is a solar farm. And so it's totally polluted. They can never use this land for anything, except MCE got a really, really cheap rental price of the land and put up a gigantic solar farm. And so if you're ever driving around the Richmond Parkway by Chevron, look for it. It's the way we have to find a great use for land that's otherwise worthless and actually quite dangerous. But the solar farm doesn't care. And so let me just say, we know what to do. We know, thanks to the people today, how to do it, both from the elected officials all the way down to the engineer making new tools. Together, we can do it. Each and every one of us knows, just from the 30,000 people marching, that when we come together and we have all kinds of viewpoints, which is fine, we have all kinds of talents, it doesn't matter. There's no one silver bullet. All of us together can bring our talents, can work with each other, and create a new and caring economy that's clean, that's sustainable, that's livable. And you know what? It also makes people happier. So let me stop on that and just say thank you, Fossil Free California, and thank the city of Berkeley and the city of Seattle activists and everyone here, because I know that this is a lifetime commitment and a lifetime process, that may we continue the journey together. Thank you.
Yeah. Continuing on what Claire was saying, I really do want to say that, we've talked about how when you break up with your bank, you can go in and let them know why you're breaking up. The other thing that I really enjoyed was going in and saying, here's why I'm breaking up, and you need to know that I'm part of a movement and that I am working to get more and more people to break up as well. I'm talking to my neighbors, I'm talking to my friends, I'm talking to my colleagues, I'm talking to businesses to separate from you until you change your practices. So that's an important part of the discussion as well. Are there any major banks that are better than others? I work for a large government agency. We've researched options and have found that small credit unions can't provide the services we need in order for us to provide something to employees and vendors. And I think this is the kind of thing that the city of Berkeley is struggling with. It's one thing to say, yes, we want to separate, but the city of Berkeley has a large number of requirements that very few single banks can offer them. And this is one of the reasons that I know that there's a strong movement to support the public bank concept, and why the Public Bank of Oakland is so important. But does anyone want to take a stab at whether if the sort of do the least harm while still investing in a major bank that offers the services that a company thinks it needs?
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. There's a bank, Bank of the West is owned by a French company, BNP Paribas. And Paribas has made some moves to cease investments in extreme fossil fuels. It isn't 100% clean, but it is beginning to bank, if you will, on cleaning up its image. It has a publicity campaign to that effect, and it's even getting some blowback from cities that rely on fossil fuels, and saying that they're going to pull their banking business if the bank's going to clean up its act. So Bank of the West is one example of a fairly sizable bank that could be a candidate. I know that the cities that study where they're going to put their their money, are faced with, requirements, a need for security, a need for collateralization, and they have to have a fairly sizable bank. The city of Davis was successful in moving to River City Bank because their contract with Wells Fargo was up at that particular time, and River City Bank actively courted them. So if you establish a relationship with a bank that wants your business, then that'll help grease the way.
Can I add a thought or two to that?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge. I don't think it's a challenge for individuals who are free to move their money anywhere they like, but for cities and larger institutions, it is a challenge. And one thing I didn't get to in my talk was the city of Seattle passed an ordinance saying it's not going to bank with Wells Fargo. About 2 or 3 months ago, it came time to renew its contract, and not a single bank bid on its contract. And so Seattle had a clause in its contract with Wells Fargo that if it couldn't get another bank, its contract automatically rolled over. So Seattle will be banking with Wells Fargo for the next 3 years, which means that an additional $9 billion are going to cycle through Wells Fargo's accounts in the next 3 years, which I think speaks to the depth of the system change that we need to see, that our cities are so chained to Wall Street, irrespective of how unjust Wall Street's practices are. And we need to see real alternatives, which I know is why the public bank fights are so key. In Seattle, we've passed funding for a feasibility study that we expect to be completed in the next 2 weeks. A group of community activists are part of consulting with the consultant about that study, and I'm lucky to be one of them. But we need to be fighting for public banks, and just like say one thing about why fighting for public banks is so important in terms of the climate fight. Free market, fundamentalist capitalism, neoliberalism is completely incompatible with the sort of rapid action and regulation on carbon emissions that we need to see on climate. And we need to really, to use an unfortunately violent metaphor, strike for the heart of neoliberalism, and that's the financial sector. And there can be nothing I can think of that's more likely to shake the fundamentalist free market form of capitalism that we've lived under in this country since at least Reagan, than major city institutions funding, creating public banks. And that really starts to change our meta-narrative in our society in ways that make action on climate much more likely.
Can I just say something about? I just wanted to add that Berkeley also had a similar issue as Seattle. They put out the RFP, and I think they got a few hits, but they weren't able to move all the money due to all kinds of reasons, but they are moving a little bit, like credit cards and things like that, and unfortunately we did the same. We now have another 3-year contract with Wells Fargo, but we're also one of the cities investing in the public bank with Oakland and the other cities locally. Thank you.
The next question has to do a little bit about what we talked about. There are so many reasons to hate the big banks. It's hard to know which one to choose. Obviously, every one of us here in the room has focused on climate change in the environment and pipelines, et cetera. But someone pointed out that there are a number of divestment campaigns, not just the fossil fuel ones. Can you talk about the challenges in divesting from the war industry and the fossil fuel industry, focusing on differences, especially because the war industry is an expanding one. So this is something that Code Pink has really been involved in basically divesting from the war economy to a peace economy. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about how partnering, all of these are interlocked, right? We've talked about sort of the intersectionality of this, but if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, As You Sow, which has provided fossil-free funds as a screening mechanism for finding out where your fossil fuel investments are, is also providing weapon-free funds, and it's based on data that will allow you to see whether, where and whether you're investing in weapons manufacturers. I think this phrase, knowledge is power, is really appropriate for bringing these wonderful data platforms to bear on your personal investments.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see, I see verticals, you know, we need to take sustainable investing from like a 2% adoption to 10% adoption, and then it's in our 401ks and everyone will have it. And in these verticals, there's climate, because this is very important, and there's guns. And guns resonates with a lot of people. And what I found was sustainable is that something's gonna bring you to it. It's not, the other one is gender equality or equality in general. And so whatever brings you to the party, when you end up in sustainable or responsible funds, they tend to be giving you all of these features. And it's just a question of connecting, well, what don't you want to own? Okay, you don't want to own guns. Are you okay with not owning fossil? Okay, and so you kind of get a resonant solution there. And
Okay.
I just wanted to say that we also have to remember not to invest in the prison industrial complex. So that's also very important.
Excuse me, I asked a question, and one of the reasons I asked it is that when you are talking about the government and war, not just the handguns and stuff, there is a political climate that is so pro-war in this country that we can individually divest, but when we're asking institutions to divest from the weapons manufacturers and companies like BlackRock and stuff, that's a whole different, that's a very different thing than fossil fuels. So I'm just wondering if you could address some of the challenges that you see in divesting from war that go beyond investing in other evil things.
I mean, what I can say is I've heard from someone in a more arcane divestment piece, which is BDS. And there are probably people in this room who are very violently opposed to BDS. So it's not kind of like a common progressive thing. And his message was, I can't get this through. I can't convince this university to care about this. But what I propose, what he proposes, is care about human rights. Put down general principles of what is appropriate. Put down policies, and it's amazing how these government organizations and universities look at their policy and go execute. So you just have to put down policies. They don't like very specific things. It annoys them. It's hard for them to work with. Come up with, and that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Yes, I personally stand up for human rights everywhere. I stand up for Palestinian rights, and I feel their struggle is our struggle. It's all the same. So we all have to invest and divest and be aware of how all that is all intersectioned, and it's all related and one issue, the human rights issue.
I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time. There are a lot of really good questions here. We'll try to get answers on there, but in the meantime, a big round of applause for our panelists. And I'm going to actually quickly call Deborah Silvey up here. She'd like to make a brief statement, but Alec, can you also repeat your email for folks here?
Sure, it's Alec, ALEC, at 350seattle.org. Alec at 350seattle.org.
Hi, I'm Chair of Fossil Free California, and I just want to thank you all for coming this morning and thank the panel. Fossil Free California has put a lot of effort into this, but I especially wanted to thank Sandy Emerson because she's the one from Fossil Free who did this, and we have a special thanks for her. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in a little bit, I hope. Thank you.
Thanks again.